Welcome to another episode of Come Together. And we're live. We're back. Scott Urbach, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining tonight.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited about being here.
Yeah, I was thinking actually on my way home. I just started school last week, and I was happy that I caught you in one of your first few podcasts after the book came out, because I feel like doing a podcast is like dating, where you talk about yourself a lot, you tell some great stories, and then after the 10th time or 20th time or 30th time of repeating it, you get a little tired, a little burnt out. So I hope that all this stuff that we talk about is going to be fresh and exciting, and I'm really excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, thanks. Me too.
So, you want to tell me just a little bit about your background, and we're probably gonna look at everything through the lens of your newfound writing career. But do you want to give me a little bit of background about yourself, and we could kind of work our way from there?
Yeah, sure. So you've already kind of alluded to some of it. I've recently embarked on what I'm hoping to be a career as a thriller author. I had my debut novel released in March of this past year. It's a CIA thriller, and which is what I know. My background is I was a former CIA officer many years ago, and over my career spanned 40 some years. I left the agency after a little while, and then has been in a global security executive for a number of international companies ever since. And so it's been a long road, an interesting one, and which has led me to the writing career now.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I had a professor that got me into writing with the first class that I went to, and the thing that he said was every great writer has at least 50 to 100 things they love more than writing, because otherwise you have nothing good to write about, and in life you're going to if you want to really be a great writer, in order to really get there, you have to be accumulating experiences to be able to have something to write about. Let your imagination work, let history work, let your experiences happen, and then you find a way to capture it and put it all into words. So I think that it sounds like the time is ripe for for a writing career based on that kind of background.
Well, yeah, and I think he was spot on with all of those comments. Obviously, they also say, write what you know, and write what you love, and write what you like to read. I'm a voracious reader, so I read across multiple genres. But I know I'd be a lousy romance writer. I think I'm much better at writing, mystery, thriller, action, adventure type books.
Have you always loved reading, and have you always had a desire to write?
I've always loved reading, and I'm going to date myself here, but I go all the way back to the Louis L'Amour Western novels, back in the 60s and 70s, and James Herriot and the All Things Bright and Beautiful books that he wrote. He was an English author, and then all the way up. Of course, as you would expect with my background, I was drawn to Ian Fleming and the James Bond series. Now those predated me; those are from the 50s, but I've read all of those, all the way up to the current day. There's a number of modern authors that I follow, religiously every time a book comes out. I'm the type of reader that every author dreams about. Because you get me hooked on a series, I'll read through the entire thing. So I think in 2023, I gave myself a goal of reading 100 books on my Kindle, and I think I topped out at 120 or so.
Yeah.
And that was everything from the classics, Old Man in the Sea or Dracula, Gone with the Wind, and then all the way up to modern genre specific action adventure type novels. So I've always been very keen on reading and writing. I, like all of us, you mentioned being in school, I took creative writing classes and things like that in school, but really never had the time to sit down and actually, put pen to paper and really write a book. And then recently in 2024, I decided it was time to finally do that, and that's what's led me to it today.
Okay, awesome. That's a spectacular segue, and it's really and it's funny because I personally have a very difficult time finding new books. I judge books based on their cover. I'm one of those people, and I try, and it drives me crazy to say because I like to be open minded, but I really, really need to be prompted to really push my way into a new book. Um, but one thing that I did notice that I think is really interesting, and maybe you've noticed just from what you've read, that there are authors that can really just like pump out writing whole books like it's a method, and like they can write 10, 15, 20 books, and you whether you have the famous Alex Rider series or Colleen Hoover, which my wife and my sister-in-law are, love reading. Like they have a formula and a process, and they just keep on churning out books. um did you pick up on any kind of pattern or any kind of throughout, while you were reading, any kind of formal structure or pattern that these kind of writers had?
Well, yeah, I mean, in my genre and others, you really want to, if you're going to have any type of commercial success, and understand there are two paths to publishing nowadays. Back in the day, there was one path. It's called trad publishing or traditional publishing, where you would write your manuscript, you would shop it to an agent or hundreds of agents and receive hundreds of rejections before somebody finally picked you up, who would then take it and sell it to what are now, I think, they're called the big five publishing houses, who would then mess with it and edit it and do all kinds of things for a year or more before it finally gets published. Then in the early 2000s, 2015, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, with the advent of Amazon, the indie publishing world really went from what was once looked down upon. It was called vanity press, and you would pay a lot of money, and a book would be printed for you and have thousands of copies stuck in your garage somewhere. Now it's not like that anymore. The indie author world is a vibrant community of really talented writers, who are writing their books, publishing their books themselves, marketing their books themselves, and having great success. Honestly, I would say at this point, 95% of the books I read are from indie authors that I can,
Wow.
as you said, that I can search online to find a book that I'm interested in. And that process actually is what led me to actually writing the book, because as I mentioned, when I went on that, goal of reading 100 books, I'd also about that same time gotten into scuba diving. It was something I've always wanted to do. So,
Cool.
so I started querying Amazon, about, scuba diving related fiction novels and scuba diving adventure stories, which led me into this entire subgenre that I didn't even know existed. There's actually a group, and I've become friendly with some of the authors in it, called the Tropical Authors Group, that have,
Cool.
there's about 50 of these guys that have, men and women that have their books that are all kind of themed around, action and adventure and sea stories and scuba diving. And so I think the first one I came across was Sharon Ward and her Finn Fleming stories, which led me to a tremendous guy, Nicholas Harvey, and his A.J. Bailey dive mystery stories. And then there's some cross-pollination between these various authors where one character from one book will show up in another book. That led me down to other authors and reading their books.
Wow.
Ultimately to a guy by the name of Wayne Stennett, who's kind of the godfather, the grandfather of this Tropical Authors Group. And he's got, to your point, I think he just published his 30th book in one specific, it's called the Jesse McDermott series. He has 30 of those. No, he's been doing it for many years. He probably puts out several a year. But then he also has some nonfiction books, one of which was called uh, it was called Blue Collar to No Collar. His journey to becoming a writer. He's a former Marine, a boat captain, a truck driver, and he explained how, one day he decided to sit down and start writing stories, and now it's his full-time job. And that's something that resonated with me. I said, that's something that I think I can do. And it goes back to my family and my kids have been after me for literally decades to write a book. Now they were envisioning me writing a memoir of some sort of my time in the agency, which I was never going to do. But
You weren't
this
going to
gave
do it
me
because it was impractical, or because
because
yeah.
I wasn't going to talk. What I did in the agency was exciting and important and fun work, but it's not something that that I would write a memoir about. That's just not who I am. But I could write a novel about what I did, loosely based on me and my career, very loosely based on me and my career. And so that's what I decided to do. And I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. And again, to your point about the old saying, you can't judge a book by its cover. Well, you really have to nowadays. And one of the first things they drill into you, if you listen to other podcasts about writing, or if you read articles about it, is two things you immediately need to have. You have to have a good title that fits your genre, and a good professionally made cover that also fits your genre. That because as people are going through Amazon or wherever they're looking for a book, even if they're at a bookstore, you got about a second and a half to grab their attention for it to really scream, this is their genre. So, my book, its title is Admit Nothing. The cover is the typical, thriller genre cover, a man, running towards trouble, gun in his hand, bright colors, et cetera, et cetera. So right away it's a thriller novel. No one's going to look at it and assume it's a romance or a fantasy or something like that. Now, if you're writing a romance and a fantasy, you want everything to look different. To have the dragons or the flames or the flowers or whatever the case may be on your book. So that's
essentially marketing, right?
Well, it's the very first step of marketing, right?
It's psychological marketing, because you're trying to capture someone's eyes and all their attention and stand out at the same time.
100%.
Hundreds of other or dozens of others in the same genre.
Right. So back to your question of, is there a formula? I believe, and again, I'm very early on this journey, but the formula should be right. Do everything right first, and obviously the very first thing you have to do is write a good book, right? You can't, no matter how good your cover is and your title is, if after the first couple pages people think it's garbage, and it clearly is, then you're not going to generate any following. But
So,
you write a good book.
I'm sorry, real quickly, just to ask to elaborate, because I want you to elaborate on this direction where you're heading down, if you don't mind. But people have a real great concept a lot of times. What makes a good movie? Do you have a concept in yourself? What makes a good book? What are you looking for when you're picking up a book? And
So again, in my genre, you need to have a compelling story, but more importantly, in my belief, a compelling characters.
right.
Your protagonist has to be, believable. I strongly believe the protagonist has to be flawed. Not if your protagonist was Superman and did everything absolutely right every time, never had conflict, never had stress in his or her life, that's just not believable. So you want a compelling story with good, solid characters that are relatable, that have flaws of some sort. In my genre, you need to have some action, some adventure, some plot twist that at the end or midway through. So there's those type of steps that you want to have and you know it, if you know what you like to read, you understand what good writing is in that genre. And
Right.
so,
You recognize the patterns. There
yes,
becomes patterns that are familiar.
there are certain patterns, and you don't want it. It's not like, you know, it's completely rote there's no creativity in it, because there absolutely is. Within certain constructs, you can do certain things with your story, and as you're writing through, I like to leave a little mini cliffhanger or drama at the end of every chapter, because you want them to turn the page. It could be 2 in the morning, and you end a chapter with a little zinger, and it's like, oh man, I really need to read the next page to see what happens next. And then you do all of that in your first book, and then ideally, if you're writing, you could make a living at this. I understand with a series of standalone books, but I think it for me it's going to be a more interesting journey to have a continuing series of the same characters, put in different situations that are somewhat related. Often that could lead to a spin-off series with, if one character really takes off and gets a lot of appreciation by your fan base. So the old saying is, nothing sells your first book better than writing your second book. So you have a good solid first book in the series, followed by a good second book, then to the third, and then to a fourth. And so my goal right now, and I'm hoping to release book 2 in the next couple of months. So my goal is to ideally write 2 books a year. It might be nice to squeeze a third one in there, but if I could write 2 books a year, market them properly, start slowly building up a readership, I'd be very happy with that. And where I was going with earlier about how I decided to write this, and the point I was getting to on the cover and the title, I told no one in my family I was doing it. It was a little secret project of mine that I was doing, upstairs in my study, and writing the book. And then the way I kind of willed it, manifested it into existence, is rather than just print out on computer paper the manuscript and hand it to my family, I actually had it properly formatted, sent it off to, I think, Barnes and Noble Press, had them and I'd hired a cover artist and all that, had it professionally printed up like a book with the cover, looked like you'd picked it up off the shelves in Barnes and Noble, and that's what I surprised the family with as my first draft, and then they became my beta readers and my first set of reviews to give me feedback. And that manuscript at that time was about 60,000 words. 60,000 words. And by the time I incorporated all my changes and future edits, it landed about 80,000 words when I finally published it.
Wow, so you added. I know for a lot of writers, their problem is actually cutting away words, not having to add more.
Yeah, exactly. And there was probably a lot of puts and takes there, because I started with, like I said, if I was editing at 60,000 words, I probably deleted 20,000 words and then wrote 40,000 back. So it was a lot of back and forth as I was editing and taking out things that just didn't make sense, putting in new things, and eventually got to the point where I just had to stop, because I would find myself waking up in the middle of the night thinking, oh, you know what, I could have said that differently on that one sentence, then gone and changed that sentence, which then led me into rewriting that entire chapter. So eventually I had to say, okay, it's good, it's ready to go, and let's put it out there in the world and see what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, I don't think as an author or as an artist anyone ever really feels 100% ready, but I think at a certain point everyone understands that it's got to go out there, whether you like it or not. But what I think is also very interesting about what you're describing is, it's actually funny because I'm very into the entertainment industry as a whole. You can hear me okay? So I'm sorry about that. What I was saying was I'm a huge fan of the entertainment industry as a whole, right? And and one of the things and the business behind it as well. And for studios, it's always easier to create a sequel than it is an original because and sequels almost inevitably make more money than the originals do, but the sequels are almost also inevitably get a worse reception with the audience, right? And because and by the way, I really think just going back to what you were talking about your method of writing and your characters and everything like that. Um, spin-offs are not bad, are actually, I think, awesome. I think they're phenomenal. I think that a good series is phenomenal. And I think that one of the hardest things to do is convince other people of an original story that they never heard of before. And so I would imagine that the hardest book to write is probably the first because you have to convince the audience that the book's good enough. And then the challenge is keeping up the quality with that first one so that it doesn't let your audience down and that you don't kind of cheapen the brand of the character. I mean, you have that kind of story, you have that kind of story that happens with Marvel where Disney talks about all the time how their mistake recently was making Marvel feel like homework. Like you had to like keep up with all this stuff and it was exhausting. You got fatigue and new material coming out all the time. And how do you keep track of the TV shows or the movies or the straight to streaming? At a certain point, people don't want to do homework. They just want to, they just want to be able to enjoy. Um, and I think that what's fun about this little world that you're playing with is that you can kind of gauge the audience response if you can. I don't know if there's a way you can as a writer, and you could tell me whether that's your, what your experience is with that. Um, but and then kind of jump on a character, or do you feel yourself like, hey, I'm in a real flow with particular characters, and I think that these characters are rich for more stories and more potential.
Well, again, being early at it, but first of all, let me step back. Your Marvel analogy is outstanding because I have this ongoing thing with my wife. She'll want to watch a Marvel movie, and I said, "Look, I'll watch a single superhero movie where there's one superhero and that's it. Preferably the origin story of that superhero. But when there's 37 different Marvel characters and or DC characters, whatever, whichever one is which, and there's this talking raccoon guy over here, and there's Thor over here doing something else, and Superman and Batman, and everyone mixed together. That is homework for me, and I can't go down that route. So, but to your point on your character journey, I think that there's the ability, and as evident by a lot of these authors I read that have 15, 20, 30 books in their series, there's plenty of room for the characters to continue with various types of adventures or incidents that they get into and have to get their way out of. And there's a lot of times there's a common thread. I really enjoy the little backstory common threads that weave through a series where somebody might be talking about a character, a minor character, a family member of something in book one,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Yeah.
is referred back to in book three, and then you see in
Yeah.
book five, the daughter's now getting married or something like that. And
Yeah.
so I really like those type of continuity plays through, and I like it when there's crossover with another. Let's say, and Nick Harvey's a great example. His A.J. Bailey series started with, it's all focused around this woman who's a dive instructor in the Cayman Islands. And then around book 3 or 4 or something like that, a plot line circled around a teenage runaway from Norway who was in the Cayman Islands, who ended up in a sex trafficking situation. She ends up, surviving it. And then in the next story, she's a bigger character. And then he spun her off. It's called the Nora Summer series. He spun her off into her own series,
Yeah.
and then refers back because AJ shows up in her books, and so I like that type of interplay. And I think for as an author, that excites me about being able to expand that world, much like I guess a fantasy author, gets likes and enjoys, world building, some new world. I'm not world building, but I'm world building around, the characters in my book who, quite frankly, I mentioned, the family pushing me to do this. Almost everyone in my family is a character in the book.
Awesome.
Some of them in true name, and using their background as plot points. And so it's been, it's a kick for them to do it. It's just littered with Easter eggs that was for them to find. There's a whole storyline the protagonist talks about his wife and their first date and where they got married and how they first met and the first and all of that is absolutely true between, because my wife was CIA also. So she and I met on the 7th floor of CIA headquarters out in front of the director's suite. And so I tell that story in the book from the viewpoint of the protagonist, but everything he talks about there really happened in real life. And, so it's something for the kids to see and, quite frankly, laugh about now. But then I put them in, their characters in the book. Now what they have to do is stay on my good side, otherwise I'll kill them off in the book. But so far
you sound like David Chase, the author of The Sopranos, the writer and creator of The Sopranos. Apparently, he was infamous for if you pissed him off, he would just have your character whacked. You come back and you read the script for the next episode,
and you're gone.
And you were killed off. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Well, I've had friends now that read the first book and now are writing me and say, "Hey, will you put me in the second book?" And I said, "Yeah, but I can't guarantee you can make it through it." "Oh, that's cool. Use my name and see what happens." And so, 2 of them are not going to make it out of the second book. I know that much. So
I see where they fall on your list of buddies.
Yeah, no, they're good guys. But so one challenge that we haven't touched on when we talk about the cadence of writing the book and how I'm trying to get out a couple a year is I have a unique situation and commitment that I have to meet when I write a book. Now, if I'm writing a cookbook, this isn't a problem. But if I'm writing anything that's CIA related, I'm still bound by my secrecy agreement that I signed, 41 years ago, day after tomorrow. It'll be 41 years since I signed this piece of paper. So I'm bound to it for life, the secrecy agreement, which states that anything I write, again, cookbooks aside, that has anything related at all to the CIA, I have to submit the manuscript for review and approval by what's called the CIA Pre-Publication Classification Review Board. So, and I did that with book 1. I sent them the manuscript. Now, understanding that I was never, and I never would intentionally divulge any true classified information. But their role is to make sure that I didn't even unintentionally do it.
How quickly did they get back to you? How bureaucratic is this?
It was less so than I actually thought. It was about a month, I think it took for them to get back to me with their redactions, and they had some. And some of the redactions were simply because, again, I've been out of the agency. I was in for a little over 10 years, so I've been out for 30. And I thought, something that I'd written in there, I wrote the name of a building. And I thought that they didn't use that building anymore. And apparently I was wrong because they made me redact that name. So I changed it. I changed the name of the building. And then they asked me to redact. They must have pulled my file and they asked me to redact some information. The protagonist mentions he worked in XYZ field office, and it was the field office I worked in, and they asked me to redact that, so I changed the name of the field office. And then,
do they tell you specific reasons why redactions have to happen?
No, they didn't tell me. They just said it was redacted. It had to be removed. They actually asked me to redact something that I completely made up. I referenced a situation where someone was standing up at a certain point, and I said there was a certain type of weapon. in the knee well of that desk, which was completely made up. And they made me redact that, which made me think, okay, I've been out 30 years. Maybe that weapon is now in the knee well of that desk. So
Wow.
maybe I just stumbled upon something that they asked me to. So I changed that. So obviously I'm going to do anything that they ask me. Now, I'm very clear, and they are very clear that the fact that they have now given me the redactions, I make the changes, and I publish the book. In no way are they endorsing the book, recommending the book or anything like that. They're just saying that it went through the process, and I was cleared to publish it. And so I have to do that now for every volume that comes out next. And matter of fact, at the end of our discussion today, I'm going to go hit send and send the manuscript for book 2 off to them for their review.
No way. It's ready. It's ready for them to review.
It's not ready to publish, but it's ready for them to review. So I'll send it to them, and it doesn't have to go back and forth multiple times, unless I were to make really substantive changes. So as long as I do the redactions that they say I need to redact, and I'm relatively certain there'll be even fewer in this book than in the first one, because the first one I was taking great pains to talk about inner workings of the agency and paint a picture, talking about the exterior of the building and the Nathan Hale statue outside of the main headquarters in the lobby, and then the seal, the Great Seal, on the granite floor of the lobby, the memorial, the stars carved in the memorial wall, what's in the CIA museum, the greatest collection of espionage-related artifacts in the world that the vast majority of people will never see. I talk about certain things in there, and how the floors are laid out and things like that. So I was putting a lot of detail in the first book. Again, a lot of it.
Did they make you take a lot of that detail out?
No, they didn't make me take. They didn't make me take hardly any of that detail out. It was more. They're really worried about what we call sources and methods, right? They're worried about either inadvertently talking about something that still remains classified, or talking about the sources and methods, techniques that they don't want put out there. So the what color the walls were and all that, they weren't too worried about that.
Right. But it's something that could be a little bit more used to understand the workings of or day to day.
Right.
Is things that they'd be more concerned about.
And the plot line also goes back to you could almost call it historical fiction, because I used real incidences that happened when I was there, involving a famous KGB defector who defected to the agency and then redefected months later, and that's a major plot line in the book. So I used his real name and real facts about that case.
Is that story classified?
No, it's not. That story itself is.
Can you tell me about that story?
Yeah, the guy's name was Vitaly Yurchenko. He was a KGB colonel that defected in 1984 or 5, I think.
So the middle of the Cold War.
Yeah, it was the middle of the Cold War, and he defected in. I think he was stationed in Berlin. I have to go back and read my book now. He was stationed in Berlin, and defected to the agency. We scooped him up, got him back to the U.S., debriefed him at a facility, and then moved him around. There's a whole bunch of moving parts around him. And what eventually happened is the members of the Office of Security, which I worked in, had him out in Georgetown at a specific restaurant, and I named the restaurant, doesn't exist anymore, but I named the restaurant, and it's it's common knowledge where it happened and the location. There's actually a plaque on the wall of the building on Wisconsin Avenue, I think, where it happened. And what happened is he asked to go to the bathroom or something, came back, told the rookie CIA security officer that was with him, "Are you going to shoot me if I walk away?" He said no, and he said, "I'm sorry, I'm doing this to you." And he turned around and walked away and walked out. And then, chaos ensued. They couldn't find him until a day or two later. He showed up at a press conference at the Soviet embassy. So then the big story was he a double agent? Was he sent there on purpose? Was he sending and all of that I work into the book. So I used a lot of true, events and weave that into the storyline of the book.
How much are you trained in? And I guess this applies for both CIA and your security job. How much are you trained in psychology and understanding people and dealing with people when it comes to when it comes to security type of positions?
So, well, it depends on your role in the agency. Obviously there are certain roles where a case officer, for example, which I was not, in the directorate of operations, a case officer is what in the vernacular people call them a spy, the ones that work overseas, and their job is to convince other people to spy for them against their country, right? So they are trained very heavily on how to manipulate people and read people and do certain things along those lines. In my world, in security, as an investigator, we are trained in certain investigation techniques, and in certain elicitation techniques, and how to interview somebody and elicit the information we want, how to gain their trust, and how to, work a case in a specific way towards a logical conclusion, while gaining all the facts that you need to gain. And the interview process is a big part of that. So there's a lot of psychology built around that and techniques that we use. And that was both in the agency, and then as my global security career progressed, you use the same type of things when you're investigating a theft or any type of threat or investigation that you have to do for a corporate entity. Is the exact same tools and skill sets I would have used during my agency days.
I see. So your skill set was able to carry over pretty easily from the public sector to the corporate. I guess from the government sector to the corporate sector.
Yeah, 100%. I did, and because I always worked in large global international companies, it directly translated. I think, I'm not exactly sure where I am right now. I've lost count, but I've probably worked in 70 countries or more, across every continent pretty much. So I've done a lot of international work, just like I did in the agency, for these global companies, again, with all the same type of issues, whether it's physical security or investigations or threat analysis. I always would have an intelligence function of some sort with my background. I would always build an intelligence function in every one of the corporate jobs I had to have a team of analysts that are looking at threats globally and how they might affect either the company itself, our personnel, our assets, our tier one suppliers, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, and that's going to get me, I think, to kind of the next, I guess, transitional phase. I'm going to come back to the book and the writing, for sure. But first of all, if there are very similar skill sets that carry over from that CIA sector to the corporate sector, is there a relationship between the two? Did you continue to have some kind of relationship? Once you're kind of working corporate, big company, private security abroad, I imagine you'd have to work with kind of American authorities if it's going to be an American-based company, right?
Yeah, certainly. We would have relationships with all manner of federal agencies, whether it's the FBI or immigration or Marshal Service, or you name it. You always wanted to maintain relationships throughout various government entities. I had a unique relationship with the agency, obviously because of my background, and occasionally they'd be interested. And this is not classified. There's a entire function of the agency whose job it is to interface with corporations and ask questions, and if there are employees that are traveling to certain areas, maybe going to a conference or something like that, the agency might want to interview those people when they come back. It's all understood, declared, above board. There's nothing clandestine about it. I would have those type of relationships, and then one situation popped up where I was in the private industry. I was getting ready to make a trip to Moscow. First time I was going to Moscow, that was a denied area when I was in the agency. I couldn't go there then,
You
but I was
applied to
going as
go and they
part.
said no?
No, just it's a denied. It was a denied area, so there had to have been a mission critical reason for me
Ah,
to have been
for you to
going
be
to
there.
Moscow. I wouldn't have gone there on vacation or something like that. So, but I was out of the agency and I was in private industry, and I had a corporate reason to go. I had mentioned it to one of my buddies that was still in, and then I don't know. It was probably a week or two before I was leaving. I got a call from the chief of station in New York asking to meet with me, and I said sure. And I went and met with him, and he told me, he said, "I understand you're going to Moscow," and I had to put the pieces together. Like, how did he know? And I said, "Oh, my buddy must have told him. Somehow it had gotten through the system." And he said, "We highly recommend you don't go." And I said, "Okay, give me a reason." And he said, "Well," and it's a little bit convoluted story, but apparently what happened is the FBI had wrapped up a retired, this is back in the days of KGB, a retired KGB officer, and the Soviets, I think it's still at the time, were not happy about it because this guy was out of the game and he got arrested. And the threat was that they were going to arrest the next former CIA guy that came in the country,
Oh
and
wow.
apparently that was going to be me. So, you know, so as soon as they told me that, I said no problem. I have no interest in seeing the inside of Lubyanka prison. I'm good. I said I'm not going, and so I postponed the trip. And then 6-8 months later, something like that, I got a call saying, "Okay, we're good to go. It's been resolved. You can go." And so eventually I ended up going, I think I visited twice, something like that.
Moscow.
But yeah. So, but
What's
that
it
was
like?
it, it was amazing. It was I went twice. I went once in the dead of winter, which I wouldn't recommend because it was cold. Everything you hear about the the freezing cold and what happened in World War II and all that kind of stuff. I can see it. And then I went one time in the spring and it was beautiful. And it, the Soviet Union had fallen at that point, and there was this weird mix of capitalism trying to start and a lot of weird things going on. But yeah, it was a great experience.
Yeah. I've been to Ukraine. I've been to Poland, um, and I kind of I went when I was in school. I spent a year studying in Israel, and part of what they do is they offer you an opportunity to go to Poland and Ukraine and kind of and get a history of World War II and what happened, and actually
Wow.
kind of go through it. Yeah, and my grandfather, who'd been a survivor, although he kind of survived, him and his family struggled through actually the Russian side of things. Um, I'm just discovering all this because he passed away 2 3 years ago, and I wasn't really aware of geography or politics or history at that point. So
Hmm.
whenever he was talking to me, it was very hard for me to process and place what was going on in my mind. But he was born in Poland right before Germany took it, I guess in World War II, on the border of Poland and Ukraine. And his family crossed over to Ukraine, figuring the Russians would be better to deal with than the Nazis. But they got sent
That's a
to
tough choice, isn't it?
yeah. I mean, America had to make that tough choice to deal with too, right? Everyone
Yeah,
had to deal at that point with that tough choice. But they chose to go to Russia, and they got sent to a slave labor camp in Siberia, or sorry, not a slave labor, a labor camp in Siberia,
yeah.
which was essentially a slave labor camp. And until they made their way to, I guess, uh, northern Asia. Towards the end of the war, they were able to get out of that part of out of the world. But I'm so fascinated now. I've been so fascinated.
Now, right there's a novel for you to write.
Yeah,
That's a really compelling
and my
story.
grandfather was actually begging me to write this because he was a historian, um, and he actually
Did
published
he
his
leave
own.
any? Did he
He
leave anything
published a
behind?
memoir.
Any notes behind? Oh,
Yeah, he published a memoir, and I could actually send it to you. I mean, it's really, really interesting, and it's written
I'd
in
love to read it. Yeah,
character.
pick. Yeah, well, pick it.
I,
It's really funny you should say that because just yesterday I dug up a memoir of sorts, a family history that was written by one of my relatives way back when, who kind of along the same lines. My family tree goes from Germany to Russia to the Volga region of Russia, and then
mhm.
so there's this German immigrant population that went to Russia, and then in the 1800s or so, uh, mid to late 1800s, immigrated to the U.S. But so there's a German Russian connection, and I just dug up this book yesterday, looking at it to say maybe a project down the line could be a family history memoir type thing using that book that was written in 19 it was written about the time I was born because I'm actually in the book that they list me as a family member,
Wow,
so it had to be
beautiful.
in 1962 or so that it was made. So yeah, if you have something from your grandfather, which I think is amazing, that would be a great jumping off point for either a true memoir written well or a historical fiction or something along those lines. That's
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I would love to, especially because now again it speaks to me, and I think that
Yeah.
he was a historian, and none of my family is, and I was the oldest to my family, so he was. So if I wasn't really interested, and none of my younger siblings are mature enough, or I guess even educated enough to really be aware of what was going on, but. But it was really, I mean, and now I have it, and it feels so cool and so special to have that bit of family history to be able to be able to relate and understand and kind of look into that. But yeah, actually, and maybe that could bring us back a little bit to the writing conversation, because my biggest problem as a writer is I have a hard time keeping track of the whole story and then getting lost in actually making the story happen. What was your process when it comes to the big picture story and then filling in the details and the characters along the way?
So in the writing community, they call it you're either a plotter, where you plot out everything, and there's many ways to do it. Some people just do it, in a notebook. Some people do it post-it notes on the wall, um, or you're a pantser. You're flying by the seat of your pants. You just start writing and see where the story goes.
That
I
sounds more
thought I
like
was a
me.
plotter. Yeah, well, yeah. So I thought I was a plotter. I plotted out my book where I thought the story was going to go, what the story was going to be. I had it from A to Z written out. And then after probably two chapters in, it took a hard left turn and went a completely different direction. And I just went with it. I just said, okay, I'm just going to go with this story the way it's written. I would come up with new. Now I saved everything I plotted out for that book. I saved it because maybe it'll end up in book 3 or 4. It's not in book 2, but yeah. So I just people also call it a discovery writer, and it really kind of spoke to me as I started writing something, and then an idea hit me, and I kept going with it and going with it, and the everything I talked about, the Yurchenko redefection, all that was none of that was in book 1. It was in what I plotted for book 1. It just ended up there as I, made my way through the story. And then, but to your point also on how do you keep track of everything, there are, some people just write in Word or in Google Docs, or there's a software called Scrivener, which is very robust, and you can have in that software you're writing in one pane, and then you have tiles, in other panes with plot points, and you can move chapters around. And you can do all kinds of fancy stuff with it. And I wrote book one in that. I'm actually using a
So it
different
almost like
software
has a
for book
built-in
two.
structure for you.
Yes, it does. You could, and there's a number of different softwares that do things like that. So you can be as sophisticated as you want as you do it. I just try and keep it all in my head as I'm going, and then I go back as I'm making edits. I'll think of something and say, okay, I got to go back to this chapter because I know that's where this incident happens, and then I'll work on it there. So, but I enjoy the process of weaving myself through the story, and then you end up, sometimes you write yourself into a corner. You end up with a plot hole you can't get out of, and then I'll sit there and struggle with it, and then one day in the
Yeah, what's
shower,
that
I'll be
like? How
driving
do you
in my
get out of it?
car. Well, eventually it comes to you. You say, okay, either you give up and you backtrack and you go a different direction, which I'm just too stubborn to do that, or you figure it out. And eventually, I figured out a way to get out of a certain plot hole that I was stuck in for weeks.
And so,
And
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, finish your thought. I'm sorry about that.
no, I was going to say, so in book one, I wrote it in a linear fashion. I started at, the opening sentence, which I rewrote 57 times, but the opening sentence, and then all the way through the end in straight order. In book two, I got myself in a little bit of a jam, and so I said, you know what, I'm going to leave this, and then I jumped ahead 10 chapters to a
Oh,
scene that I
whoa.
had in my head that I knew I was going to write. So I jumped ahead to that scene and then went back and bridged the gap. And so that was a way to get me out of, get my head out of this plot hole I was in, go write a scene that I knew I was going to be in there, and then figure out how I was going to bridge them.
It's so
And so
funny that you say
that was a
that.
fun way to do it this way.
It's a great method. I had a teacher that used to say, you got to plan your life somewhere between 5 minutes and 5 years from now. And if you don't know what it's going to look like in 5 minutes, then think about it in a year or in a week or in a month, and where you want to be and how you're going to bridge those two, right? And I think that's a very
Yeah,
similar experience that what you're just describing. Where sometimes if you don't
exactly.
know the right path to take, look where you want to end up, and then see what options lie before you. I think it's really cool. Another thing that you mentioned that I wanted to kind of jump on also, that I wanted to bring some more light to and focus to, is that you don't throw out or get rid of any of these like plot points that you start wandering down and meandering down. And just even today, I had some students. I'm teaching ninth grade the difference between capitalism and communism, and 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 my students are trying to write these answers, and they get frustrated, they rip up their paper and throw it out. I'm like, no, what are you doing? they're like, it's not good. I'm like, it's fine. It's important that you keep track of the way that you're thinking, and important for you to be able to keep this and look back and be able to say, oh, right, that didn't make sense, this makes sense, or
Right.
that
Yeah,
couple of
100%.
sentences worked out, this couple of sentences didn't, but at least you can save a little bit for later. Another great um, writing exercise that we did when I was learning how to write creatively was everyone would write a poem, for 5-10 minutes, whatever it was, and then everyone would read their poem out loud, and you would write whatever details. It could be a word or a line or a description or a sentence. You would write what captured you, and you'd be forced to integrate that into your next poem because there's something about that that stuck out to you enough to make itself stick in your head, and there's a reason for that. So don't throw that out. That's not garbage. Use that again. Recycle it. And I
Yeah,
think that almost any
100%.
writer will tell you recycling is a huge part of the industry.
Yeah, I mean, because you never know when that nugget that you had before will fit someplace else, or just serve as inspiration to get you to say, yeah, this was okay, but I could now use it in a different way, or give you the inspiration to take off on another project.
Yeah. So tell me about your how you got into the agency. Was this a family thing? Was this like a patriotic thing? Was
No,
this
no,
something you just weren't sure what you wanted to do, so you decided to end up there? How'd this happen?
no. It was more of the patriotic thing. So uh, I went to school in San Diego, at UC San Diego, and was graduating as a political science major. This was after I had spent 3 years as a pre-med major. But
Whoa.
after I failed organic chemistry for the second time, I figured, the doctor thing's just not going to work out for me. So,
I've heard that, by the way,
so
about organic chemistry from a lot of pre-med students. They've all said that.
yeah, well, organic OChem and I did not get along. So I thought to myself, what else do I like? I like politics back then, and I still do. So I dropped,
And how old are you around
I
this
think I
point?
had.
This is, I guess, college. You were
So
this is
this is my junior year, halfway through my junior year of college, and
and
so
what's going on in
I
the country
dropped.
that you're involved politically right now?
Oh, now or back
No, no,
then?
no, no, no. Back then, what made you interested back
Oh, so
then?
well back then. So this was 19. I graduated in '84. This is like '83. So it was Ronald Reagan and the shining city on the hill type thing, and the Soviets were the Red Menace, and so all of that was kind of building the world around me, and so I became a poli-sci major. I graduated on time. I was able to drop all the science classes, pick up all the poli-sci classes, worked my butt off to get out in time. And again, so now I'm dating myself. This was the internet didn't exist, and what I did is I walked into the career center one day, and there's a bunch of binders on the wall, for various companies and agencies and not for profits, and you name it. What any college career center would have for every major. And I'm looking, and there was one there that said Central Intelligence Agency. And I knew I wanted to do something in the government with my poli-sci background. And so I was applying to, congressional offices. I applied with what back then was called the Naval Investigative Service. And I pulled the agency one down, and I read through what they were looking for. And, of course, it seemed really interesting to me. So I'm sure I went back to my dorm room and pulled out the typewriter and typed out a letter and sent it off in snail mail. And, weeks later, I got a phone call from a Mr. Jones. And, of course, I immediately thought that was a pseudonym. Turns out his name really was Mr. Jones.
Oh, get out of here! What are the odds?
Yeah. It started going through the interview process. And they were looking for, it was, again, for your listeners, this was 40 years ago. So a much different time in the world. And they were looking for the all-American men and women who could, for God and country, join the agency, pass a polygraph, and go out and do their work. And
Pass your polygraph.
I fit that.
Assuming you're not lying about something, or pass a polygraph that shows you know how to
So
make
yeah,
something.
well, no, to assume you're not lying. So part of the background, the background investigation was very intense. They do a full scope. We call it a full scope background investigation. Everywhere I had lived for the past 15 years, every place I had worked, which admittedly wasn't much. I had a couple of part-time jobs. I was coming right out of school. The family members were interviewed, and friends, and other people were developed as to be interviewed as to everything about me. Then I had to go back and pass a medical exam and pass a polygraph to prove that I wasn't a Soviet agent and all of that type of thing. And when I got to the polygraph part, I said, okay, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get this job, because I knew I wasn't a Soviet agent. I knew I'd passed the poly. They still really, yeah, they still really put you through the ringer on that thing. And then when you're in, you get repolyed. They call it periodic reinvestigations, repolygraphs. every couple of years. And, it's never a pleasant experience, but if you got nothing to hide, you got nothing to hide as you go through it. My wife, on the other hand, failed it every time. She would get,
Really?
I don't know how they ever hired her, because every time she took the poly, she just got so nervous. She would end up failing and have to go back and take it again, until she finally, got through it. But, they could tell if you're being deceptive or if you're just being nervous and making the box flutter, so they're really good at what they do. There's an art to it. There's a science to it, and there's an art to being a polygrapher. I toyed with the idea of joining the becoming a polygrapher and joining that team when I was in,
cool.
and never actually went down that road. But
by the way, that could
so
also
yeah,
be
so
a cool world to dive into, as from an author's perspective.
yeah,
I mean,
100%, and that
it's cool.
yeah, that'll definitely that'll play somewhere in my stories. I mean, I think I mentioned it in book one, as just as a side comment about having to take a polygraph exam, when you're inside the agency. But so that process, it takes quite a while. I think I graduated in May or June, and I'd started the process before I graduated, and like I said, I entered on duty in September of '84. So
It took about 3 months.
it took a few months to get through.
Right.
Yeah,
And can
and
I
it's probably
ask,
it's longer now.
please, sorry, finish your thought. I'm sorry.
Not to say it's longer. I'm sure it takes longer now, and they're looking for different skill sets now. Now I'm sure they want people with extensive overseas experience, who've lived overseas, worked overseas. Again, depending on the type of roles, for a case officer, they're going to want somebody that speaks foreign languages and has other type of experiences that I didn't have back then. But I also wasn't looking, at that point, I wasn't looking to become a case officer. I was drawn to the security side. So I spent my career doing investigations. I spent a long part of my career, which is what the books are based on the director's protective staff. Back then it was called the DCI security staff. Now it's called the director's protective staff. They're the internal team that protects the director and the deputy director and their families. And so I spent a long time doing that, traveling around the world doing that for a long time. That's the basis for the primary character in my his name is Grant Hunter in my Grant Hunter thriller series.
Wow. Okay, I got a lot of follow-up questions over here, but this is great. First of all, I guess, and this could be just quick. This is a quick follow-up. Is the case officer something that's just glorified by Hollywood, or does it have a lot of status in the agency that, he's a case officer, she's a case officer, and it's really hard to do, it's really impressive, and so you have more respect for them? Or is that just kind of...
Well, no, I mean, they definitely... I mean, every role in the agency is important. So there you have your case officers are the ones that are out primarily overseas, working their assets to gather the information that's important to the country. Then you have, so that's a very important role, and that's the one that tends to get glorified most by Hollywood. But then you have
role to get, or is it one of the more difficult roles or careers to get within the agency, or that's just subjective?
I mean, again, it depends on your skill set. If there arguably some would say, the ground branch paramilitary team is a very difficult role to get because you have to come into that with military experience and background,
right.
tier 1 work. So case officers is a difficult because you have to have it's a very difficult life. You have to have a specific mindset to do it. You're undercover primarily your entire career. Now I was undercover my entire career, so that's a
you were undercover security.
It's I was undercover, so I was not a declared agency person until I left. They opened me up when I left.
Wow!
But during my
you
entire
totally,
time,
quote unquote, work for them?
Yeah, so I didn't, if you asked me who I worked for, I would have given you my cover My wife and I had to come up with a cover story of how we met because she was open. She was a known open CIA employee, and I was undercover. So we had to have a cover story of how we met. We had to have a cover story of why was the director of the CIA at our wedding. Because so we had to
Wow.
have a cover story for that. We had, there was, it's a difficult lifestyle when you're under. Now, only a small fraction of agency personnel are undercover and have to go through that type of process and understanding of how you're going to live your life. So yes, a case officer is a difficult role, but it's you know it could be argued that an analyst has an equally difficult and arguably as important a role because they have to take the raw data that's coming in from the field and synthesize that into actionable intelligence that the
Yeah.
policymakers can then use. So you have your collection side of the house, you have your analysis side of your house, there's a directorate called the Directorate of Science and Technology. Those are all the big brain guys that are coming up with the covert communications and the latest and greatest technology for eavesdropping and dead drops and all of those kind of things. So that's a very important role. And then you have what in my day is called the Director of Administration. I think it's called the Director of Support now, and that's everyone else that makes the agency run. So without the security team and or the psychologists and the medical professionals and the lawyers and the congressional liaison and all of the other things that make the people you hear people refer to the agency as a company, make the company run equally important. So it just depends on where your skill sets fit, and you got linguists and everything else in between. Um,
Hmm.
it's a it's a fascinating place to work.
I can imagine. I can totally imagine. The other thing I wanted to ask you, just based on your answers before, and maybe you can give me a little bit of a context, understanding and context. One thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is the fact that history didn't start today, or last year, or 5 years ago, or when I was born. And I'm really, really curious, especially when you were politically, active or interested and engaged in the 80s. What do you think? What was like the core difference between what was considered a liberal back then and a conservative back then, relative to today? And what like obviously Russia was the big blip on America's radar in the 80s. Um, what was the did everyone agree left and right that Russia was a problem? Did and it was just a difference in how to resolve it or how to deal with it, or was there a question as to whether or not Russia was even a problem? Whether what was the political world like while you were engaged in it? And you feel free to elaborate on your personal opinions or to leave them out, whatever you're more comfortable with.
Yeah, so yeah,
But
this is definitely the world according to Scott, and not agency doctrine or anything else.
right.
I mean, obviously, you've already hit on it. It was a completely different world in a number of different ways. Yes, there was it was still when I was there, it was still the Soviet Union, which was the big primary a not the but a big primary focus, but so was China, right? So, and
In
and
the 80s?
then there was how. Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
So China was not as sophisticated as the Russians were, as far as geopolitical. And again, my opinion, geopolitical influence peddling and all of that as the Soviets were. Because remember the Soviets were, again, decades before, causing mayhem with the Cuban Missile Crisis and things like that, where they were pushing their influence out and threatening the U.S. in a number of different ways. And when I was in, the Soviets had made their move into Afghanistan, and so we were supporting the Mujahideen and it was a proxy war of sorts,
Right.
supporting
Charlie
them,
Wilson's War is that
and
famous
as they,
movie.
well, that's exactly where I was going. It's a little bit dramatic, but I think it was Charlie Wilson's War is an excellent movie for any of your listeners that are interested in that time period to go watch, because it's
I just
from
rewatched it
my
this past week.
limited, yeah, I think it's outstanding. It tells the story in a fairly accurate way of how the agency started building up um, its support of anti-Soviet forces. Now, I think the agency will be the first to admit, and I will too, after the Soviets left, we dropped the ball there, and which allowed the fermentation of the radical Islamic extremism, which ended up coming back to get us on 9/11, right? So
Yeah,
there's
full circle, right?
there's lessons to be there's definitely lessons to be learned there, but and then the other thing, you asked about what was conservative and what was liberal. Back then it was, Democrat and Republican. But if you think, and I know that I'm much older than you are, but back then, the Democrats and the Republicans actually worked together. You'd have Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House for decades, would work with Republicans and vice versa to actually get some things done. It wasn't
Freaking
this bomb
kills me.
throwing animosity that we have now, but a lot of a lot of the social ills that we have now, I'm convinced are part and parcel to the advent of social media and the fact that anybody can say anything at any time and push it out to millions of people. And so there's the extremists on both sides are, to me, very. It's very disappointing. And I was
It's
asked in
dangerous.
another
Forget about disappointing. I think it's
podcast.
dangerous.
Yeah, well, I think so as well. But I was asked in another podcast: is do I let any of that into my writing? And I'm being very deliberate not to. It just, like I said, it's disappointing, and I think it's dangerous to a certain extent. But B, just as as an author, and you want to, you're also a businessman because you've got this business around your books. I don't want to automatically,
Turn off half your audience.
piss off half of my reading audience because I land on one side of the political spectrum or the other.
Right.
So that's just not good business. But also, I don't think it's compelling storytelling either, unless there's
at the time,
a specific plot point you're trying to make.
So at the time, left and right
Cool.
agreed that there was the same issue, and they just had varying degrees or, I guess, line or responses and what would be appropriate to deal with the issue. Because it feels like today, and one of the reasons why I even started this podcast to begin with, is because today we can't even agree on what the same freaking problem is. I mean, you could tell someone, hey, this this group is a problem, and they'll be like, what group? And then and then you wait 4 years, and then the next group will be like, that was a big problem. You're like, what? You just didn't respond. You didn't talk about that for 4 years because we were talking about it, and it doesn't
Yeah,
make
it's
and everyone's
100%
guilty of
that.
it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Both sides are guilty of it, and it's it's the extremist viewpoints on both sides. I mean, you couldn't get them to agree that the sky is blue, right? On
Yeah.
any given day. So when there's absolutely zero common ground at all, I don't know how anything can get done. So it's
What?
we're
Yeah.
certainly not going to solve it on this podcast, but it's a
For you things.
significant problem. But
Yeah, it is. One thing that you just mentioned also was the online presence, which has become extremely, I guess, controversial. Um, and one of the points that people make is that potentially that, and almost certainly, not even potentially, that different intelligences around the world will kind of try to push or highlight stories on online to kind of create or force a narrative. Um, you know, and on one hand, you kind of feel torn because you want to protect freedom of speech. On the other hand, these are potentially foreign adversaries acting. Do you have any? First of all, I think that's a great thing to implement into a book, right? Into the question of what to do with such a thing. But do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly. I mean, we've seen it's the case, and again, on both sides, you have various adversaries that are pushing as you say, a narrative, or I hate the term fake news, just to try and muddy the waters, or maybe influence those that are susceptible to it. I mean, I truly believe people have a duty to be aware of what who and what they're voting for, but those that are more susceptible to a certain type of rhetoric or whatever, certainly that happens, and now we're getting into even more, I believe, dangerous territory with the advent of AI and the things that can happen in AI. That back in the day, a politician would get caught in a sex scandal or something. There'd be a photo of them, and they'd always say that photo was doctored or photoshopped, and it never was. It was always them. Well, nowadays with AI and what they can do,
You can't tell.
they can make a whole videotape and you cannot tell. So it's just a strange new world that we're all going to have to get ourselves through. And again, I'd be the last one to say I have any true answers for any of these problems. But as you keep alluding to, there's plenty of fodder for future storylines and plot lines and ways to
Yeah,
weave
that
some of
looks fun.
these challenges into the book. And right now I'm, because of how I wrote the book one with references to what was happening in 1984 with the Yurchenko defection and all that, the book one was kind of set in like 2012. Book two is like in 2014, 2015. Eventually, I'll be moving forward, and I always have to catch myself and go back, and as I'm doing research on a certain technology or a weapon system or an aircraft or whatever, I have to go back and Google it or ask ChatGPT, did this exist in 2014?
There you
Because the last
go.
thing I want to do is get called out for saying, no, Scott, that didn't come out until 2022. So
Yeah,
so yeah,
I'm so
there's
happy you brought that
as
up.
I move the storyline, as I move the storyline forward, I will eventually be incorporating some of these newer challenges and topics into future stories.
Yeah, what's your homework like? Right? What's your homework like when it comes to a topic? Because there are people. I have a friend of mine, and I met him a couple of months ago, and he's a great dude. And one thing that he does so well is that every time he's interested in a topic, he loves doing deep dives and homework into and like crawling into these rabbit holes, and just seeing where he ends up. What's your homework like when it comes to writing this? Do you do homework hoping to find new material, or do you have the material in advance and look to do homework after that? What's the process?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, obviously, I knew as I went down this one storyline with the Yurchenko defection, I knew where I was going with that, and I'd lived some of it, and I'd researched that particular case quite a bit, and I was polling from multiple sources, not just Googling it. I was going to the agency, and you can go online in the agency and look at certain things that they're published about certain issues where it's declassified, it's out there. So I was researching that, and then I would, I had to go through. There's part of the plot line involves the use of one-time, cipher one-time pads. So I had to get smart because I had never actually used one myself on how a one-time pad worked. So I went down that rabbit hole, and then the book was initially set. The initial scenes are in Thailand. Now I'd visited Thailand and worked in Thailand on several occasions, so I had broadly knew what I was talking about. But then to make specific, if I was describing a surveillance detection route, I wanted to be accurate. So then I was researching the roadmaps, and if I was running an SDR in Thailand today, these are the roads I would take, and then weaving that into the book. So there's, I think that the research is just as enjoyable as the writing part. There's a
I
lot
bet it
to
is.
get into.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Did you watch White Lotus when this newest season? Are you a fan of the show?
No, my wife is a fan, but I don't think I've ever seen it.
You should check it out. What I think you would like about it, especially from a writer's point of view, is that it's a very deliberate and intentional and it feels like there was a lot of love and attention put into every single shot and every single scene. And and so from a commercial sense, it's not too, typical in terms of like popping and cutting and whatever it is. But from a storyteller's perspective, it's really a work of art. And the latest season was in Thailand. Um, which is what I was asking about. But
Yeah, that's what she told me it was. Yeah,
I find it fascinating that you know, and I guess this is done, and I guess this is for good reason, but how little we know about, like, how little, at least Americans seem to know about the rest of the world. Like the Far East, Thailand and Japan and, China. And I mean, these are all rich cultures that have been around for thousands of years that I don't remember hearing. I didn't even, I couldn't point out a map where they were, and I didn't even notice how much ground they covered on the map, and it's something that's not really discussed, but it's a remarkable culture, isn't it?
yeah, it definitely is. And the more you travel the world, the more glaring that becomes because you it's amazing. You go to a number of places, how many people speak English as their as a second language,
Hmm.
just because of how business is run. And yet, we have people here that have no clue, again, where to locate certain places on a map or how to act when they travel. And so, yeah, it like I said, it's interesting when you see people stumbling through certain places. And I've always enjoyed learning each of the cultures, in places where I've worked to try and respect their customs and norms and everything else to make sure that I'm not the quintessential ugly American traveling someplace.
But there's no place like home at the same time, I
That's very
suppose.
true. There's no doubt
Yeah,
about it.
yeah. I went on a honeymoon a couple of years ago. We went to Greece, Italy, and Ireland for our honeymoon. It was a ton of fun, and I've been to Dublin once before that. And we're in Greece. I think we're in Italy, and we're talking to a couple on the street that we'd met, that we were just hanging out with, and it was at a bar, and they said, "What do you call someone that speaks three languages?" I'm like, trilingual. They're like, "Yeah." What do you call someone that speaks two languages? I'm like, bilingual. Like, and someone that speaks one language. I'm like, American. And I was like, oh man, you guys, you guys really didn't have to do much like that. That cut deep, but it was funny. It's true
That's
because
funny.
we were talking, and and we were in Italy, and another couple came up and asked us a question. Tell me, I wanted to actually ask you about work-life balance because I presume based on everything you're telling me, you got a family, including the fact that your kid went to college in New Orleans and another kid in California. Um, what was work-life balance like? I know that there's like a newfound, almost like it's almost like part of everyday life no matter what, but I'm sure that wasn't the case while you were working security or at the agency. So what'd you do?
Yeah, no. So you're right. Way back in the day, work-life balance wasn't a term that anybody used. And initially, as I said, my wife was in the agency too, so she knew what she was getting into with me. That I'd be disappearing for weeks at a time. And you mentioned you recently got married. I disappeared like for 3 weeks right before the wedding,
No
in the crunch time
way.
of wedding planning. And I was gone on a 3 week Middle East trip. So I wasn't too popular at home for that one. But she knew what she was getting into, the lifestyle I was in. Her father was a police officer. Her brother was a police officer. So she knew about that. And then when, fast forward a few years and we started having kids, same thing. She ended up, she worked initially, and then we did the math, and the math wasn't mathing, and it wasn't making sense for her to continue working. She had left the agency by that point. She had been, at one point, she had just been lured away by private industry for, they were looking to hire people that had security clearances, some of these beltway, companies that were doing work with the government. So she had left the agency, and then eventually when we had kids, it didn't make sense for her to work anymore. So she was home with the kids. We were fortunate enough to have that, be the case.
That
But
was
I would
beautiful
be,
America. You could do that.
yeah, right. It was a while ago. But then I was, transitioning to corporate America, where, as I mentioned before, I was still traveling extensively overseas, quite often. So, she took on the burden of the family at that point, and I'd be present when I could be. Then, as the corporate life continued, and I got more senior in my position, I didn't have to travel necessarily as much because I had teams that were doing it, and then all the way up to more recently when work-life balance became an actual issue. But of course, over the last 5-6 years, we had the COVID issue hit, and then working remotely became a thing that didn't exist before. So that was a big pivot to be able to say, okay, now our kids were older at this point, but again, being able to literally work from anywhere, has been beneficial. And it's a completely different world now for my kids, the three of them, in their careers. Two of them work fully remote.
Isn't that
And
amazing?
yeah, and they have thriving careers, and they're able to do that. And
Yeah.
quite frankly, I was mostly remote for the vast majority of the pandemic. Before we started going back, and even then, now I'm in the office 4 days a week, because I screwed up. I retired. I had served 12 years as a chief security officer for one of the big three automotive companies here in Detroit. I retired in last year, knowing that I would probably get back in the game at some point, and that's when I wrote the book and did all that. And then I screwed up one day and answered the phone call from a headhunter, and I got dragged back into the corporate world, and I'm really enjoying a totally new field right now. But so now
Are you
I'm
still in
balancing.
security?
I'm the vice president of security, safety, and loss prevention for a very large global, in our space, the largest restaurant chain in our space. So it's a new world for me, being in the the restaurant type world. But so I'm now balancing. You talk about work-life balance. I'm balancing, running a global operation with my family obligations here, a brand new grandchild, and then now this my burgeoning author career as well.
Well, congratulations on the grandchild, first of
Well,
all.
thank you. Yeah.
Very exciting.
Yep.
Um, Yeah, yeah. Did you ever talk to you? But it was just. I guess my question is, it was just like from an emotional level. It was just reality that dad's busy, dad's working, dad's out of the house. Or how did you feel as dad? For particular events, being away for weeks at a
Yeah,
time.
I mean, I tried my best, as I'm sure you do, and others, that to be present when I could for major events and all that. I don't think I missed, you know, I know I missed some Christmases, where I was out on assignment and things like that. And I'm sure I missed birthdays, but I tried to be as present as possible when I could be. It was interesting when my granddaughter was born. My son-in-law, my daughter obviously had a long maternity leave. My son-in-law had an equally long paternity leave,
I
which
know that's new
didn't
too.
exist, which absolutely did not exist when my kids were born, 25 years ago and more. So I think I was off for a day and a half or something to help out at
Yeah,
home, and
I had eight
then I
hours
was back
off.
at it. Yeah, exactly. So, um, so it's different, but again, you have to be thoughtful and attentive to when you are home, that you are present with the kids, and and again, I'm the last one to give parenting advice, but we've been blessed and successful with our family, and we had the support of other family members to help when needed, and it was just a different world than it is today.
It was, it's funny. I was talking to a friend of mine this weekend, and she was, and they were complaining. Him and his wife were complaining that their family lives a little far away, another state, and they feel bad saying that their kids. They have, like, I think, three kids under the age of 5 or 6, and they said they feel bad saying their kids take up all their energy because they know how wonderful it is. But I said to them, I was like, you guys are living in one of the first generations in history, where family doesn't just like move in with you and help out, or you don't move in with family, and like you guys don't live together as one big unit where everyone helps take care of each other. Like this is one of the first times ever that someone moves, away from to a different state, from their parents, and has kids and is just left by themselves in this new state trying to raise the kids by themselves. I was like, you shouldn't feel bad about being exhausted. It's like, like the world didn't. I don't think the world really, like you said, when you were gone, you had other family members that were able to help step up. But
That's
it's just a
true,
truly changing world.
yeah, and you're right. The no, my family, we had moved away from my parents' family support, so it was a big deal for us to see our grandparents. It was a once a year thing that I always thought it was so cool to it was exciting to go see your grandparents, and I couldn't understand how my friends, they see their grandparents every weekend. They live
Hmm.
next door. They live down the block, and that was
Yeah.
totally foreign to me. And then the way our lifestyle has developed, my brothers, there's three of us, and we live across the country from each other. So my one brother still lives in California, where we grew up, but the other one lives on an island off the coast of Washington State, and I'm out here in
Nice.
Detroit. But I spent almost 20 years, and well, actually more than that, between Washington and New Jersey, and so we're used to having families spread around and then valuing our time together when we can get together
Hmm.
with everyone, and we're making more of an effort now to do that, to have, I heard it called experiential, rather than Christmases where we the girls don't need another purse, the guys don't need another watch.
Yeah.
So the last few years we've been thoughtful about, okay, at Christmas we're going to all go together on a trip someplace and go scuba diving, and or whatever the case may be, go on a cruise. One year we did. So
Yeah.
just trying to be together when we can, rather than just do the materialistic things.
When I was, it's so funny you say that because I my primary job is I do sales, and so even though I've been working remote since 2019, since before it was cool, and 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 so, even though I'm always remote, I'm never off the clock. And so, for our anniversary this past year, we had a 1.5-year-old, and my wife was expecting, and we had no idea, like it just kind of snuck up on us. And I put my phone away for the first time. I was like, I'm just not going to take any calls today. We're just going to go to the beach and just walk. We live 5 miles from the beach, but we never go there. And we had such a pleasant day where we just acted like tourists in South Florida. And I just put my phone away for
Yeah,
just the day, and we just spent time together. And it was so wonderful. And I'm craving for that. And like, I'm thinking about the next time I could take a vacation like that, because I really do. I think that there's always a give and take, and we always take certain things for granted. But I think that everyone reaches a point in their lives where it could happen earlier or later, but where the quality of what you're doing matters so much more than, like, the amount of money you spent to get there, or where you're eating, or what you're doing, or something like that.
100%. I agree.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me about scuba diving real quick before we hang up, because apparently this is a passion of yours, and I would love to hear about it.
It is, and it's something my wife got sick of me talking about. So I remember again. So it might have been our way back when on our anniversaries we used to just try and get away. So this was probably our second or third anniversary. I think we might have had one kid that we left with my mom, and we went out to Catalina Island and spent the weekend out there. And I was walking down the pier, and the guy said, "Hey, you want to try scuba diving?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Okay, put this on, put this on, put this on, breathe through this, let's go." And we jumped in the water. It was, I don't know how I didn't drown. And then,
Sounds amazing.
fast forward, and I didn't drown, thankfully. And fast forward, 30 some years later, I was still talking about, wanting to do that for real and learn how to do it. And we had a couple of tropical trips lined up, kind of what I was just talking about, that we were doing with the family. And she said, "Will you shut up and just do it already?" And I'm like, I'm 60 years old. And, can I really do this at 60? And it turns out I could. And I
You
fell in
could.
love with it. Yeah, I absolutely loved it. And so I've really gotten into it, and every opportunity I can, I'm diving, even though I tend to get seasick and I have to deal with all that problems once I'm under the water. And it's that whole new world, and there's a technical challenge to it that I find exciting, and making sure that I get down there and get back up without any drama. And so I've gotten rec certified, diving recs down in South Florida, and
Next time
I've
you come
dove.
down, you have to let me know.
Are you a diver? I'd love to.
Well, I'm not a
But
diver, but you can teach me, and if not, I'll have you over
yeah,
for dinner. But I
I
mean,
could
either
definitely,
way,
I
maybe
can,
someday.
influence you. Yeah. So yeah, I love diving down in the Keys. So I've done a lot of diving down there. I've dove overseas every time we go on vacation. I find the opportunity to dive. I dove in Turkey and Greece and places
Wow,
like that.
amazing,
I've dove
amazing.
in Missouri. You wouldn't think there's a place to dive in Missouri, but there is. It may be closed now. I'm not sure. Called the Bon Terre Mine. It's an old Civil War lead mine that's got it's
Wow.
160 feet deep of crystal clear water, and it's like an underground lake. So it's not cave diving because you can get to the surface, but it's this underground lake. Now it's on an old guy like me, it's rough because you're humping all your gear down, a quarter mile underground to get to the dive platform to then dive this thing and then have to haul everything back out again. But that was a unique and different experience. So
Have you
um,
have you been to Crater Lake in Oregon or California?
I
I
have
guess it
not.
depends.
No. Yeah.
So, do you know what it is? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I do people dive there, because that's a
I
lake the
think.
size of a mountain,
Yeah.
or a
I
volcano.
think. I think. I'm sure somebody has, but again, you have to get all your gear up there and all of that kind of stuff. So,
But you could drive up to
um,
the surface. I mean, I
yeah,
drove. I used to live in Washington, and I drove down to San Francisco once to meet a buddy. We took one to go south. We took five more inland on the way up, and
yeah,
um, and on the way up, we stopped at Crater Lake, and I'm not exaggerating when I say within 45 minutes, the temperature went from being 115 degrees in desert to being snow-covered mountaintops with
Oh
this,
yeah.
with this beautiful lake that's just in the center of it. But I mean, you could walk right up to the surface of the lake if you wanted to. I
Oh,
just
then
like
I'm sure there's people that dive it then. And here in Michigan, we have tremendous wreck diving, and they're not purpose built, you know, wrecks that were sunk on purpose to be a reef, like in Florida, the Spiegel Grove and the Duane and some of these massive wrecks that are down there. Up here, they're 1800 vintage wooden schooners that went down in the Great Storm of 1913 or something like that. And so and it's cold, fresh water, so they're extremely well preserved. So there's some fantastic wreck diving up here in Michigan and Lake Huron and Lake Michigan and others that I've enjoyed, diving some of those wrecks. So
so
yeah,
cool,
so
so cool.
that's a whole nother podcast, but I can talk about diving a lot,
Yeah,
and I just
I
continue
honest,
to try to get better and better at it.
honestly, it's as cool to me as everything else we've spoken to today. I mean, I found the whole underwater world just so captivating and so mysterious. And
Well, you're in a
it's
perfect place for it down there.
I was it's so funny because you mentioned oh, like a guy, an older guy like me. I was reading a biography recently, and I hopefully will have the author on the podcast soon too, of a Grateful Dead biography, and Jerry Garcia, who is not known for his health habits to say the least, became an avid diver in like
Did
his
he?
40s or 50s, yeah, and he loved it, and he said the same thing. Not the same thing, but he said that once he got underwater, because physically he was in the worst condition a person could really put themselves into, but but underwater he was just like it's another universe, and even the way that you move and the way that you function and your interaction with the world is so fundamentally different that
Oh
like
yeah.
it just feels like a whole new life. Like you're just living a new life under there. So yeah, maybe we'll do part two about scuba diving, or in a couple of months when your next book is ready to come out. You can let me know.
I'd love to.
But Scott, it's so much fun talking to you. This is a real pleasure, and I'm really excited to see what your career is going to be, what your writing career is going to become.
Well,
Because
thank you
and
very
I
much.
look forward to checking out your book, reading it, and really diving in. And then when I get a couple of beers in you one time when you come to South Florida, you'll tell me what's made up in the story and what's not.
I'd be happy to do that. I really appreciate you having me on. I've very much enjoyed it. Thank
Good,
you very much.
excellent. I hope this is a good podcast experience. You should have many more. I'll talk to you soon. All
It
right,
was
Scott.
great.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Take
Yep.
care. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye bye.